sick of being sick? So, welcome to all of you. Before we get underway, I wanted to take a moment to pause and reflect on some of the history that has brought us to this point and how we might individually and altogether contribute to moving forward on the path of reconciliation. This land on which the University of Toronto operates has for thousands of years been a gathering place for many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. It has been stewarded as a site of learning, exchange, teaching, and sharing. This has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Seneca. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we at the law school are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and work and build a community in a good way together on this land. The Wright Lecture is dedicated to the memory of Dean Cecil or Cecil Wright. He assumed the deanship in 1949 and built up the modern Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto with a then unique focus on academic legal education. He first actually had to resign his post as Dean of Osgoode Hall and reject the Law Society's apprenticeship model in favor of U of T's vision of a full-time legal education hinging on the professional bachelor's degree and centered in a university. Wright worked to shape a new kind of law school that then in turn ended up transforming legal education in Canada. And so the lecture that bears his name is intended to be a lasting memorial to the contribution that he has made, and it is this faculty's most significant public lecture. In the past, this lecture has been delivered by a long list of distinguished scholars, and I'm delighted that we are able to add to this list here today. And to that end, getting us to introduce our wonderful speaker properly, I'm delighted to turn things over to Professor Larissa Katz, who's the faculty's Associate Dean Graduate Programs, and she will introduce the first Wright lecturer since the pandemic, so an especially wonderful moment. Larissa.
Thanks, Susan. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Jedediah Purdy, known to many of us just as Jed, who will present, as Jutta has described, the Cecil A. Wright Memorial Lecture. Professor Purdy is the Raphael Lemkin Professor of Law at Duke Law School. I just want to say a few words about Professor Purdy's scholarship, which makes him such an outstanding choice for this year's Wright Lecture. He is, of course, well known as an outstanding legal scholar, but he's also an inspired and brilliant intellectual who has had, I think, a real and substantial public impact on thinking today across a wide range of legal, social, and moral questions, ranging from topics on the environment, property, and democracy. So his work, which is prolific, is a distinctive and striking blend of doctrinal, historical, and philosophical insights. The result is a sometimes personal, but always profound contemplation of complicated and so important human phenomena, as we've seen in the books that he has written in the past on property law, but also the books that he has given us this year alone. There's 2 of them, which relate very much to the theme of today's lecture. So one of these books, and I've borrowed my colleague's copy to show you, is 2 Cheers for Politics: Why Democracy is Scary. Actually, it says here, Why Democracy is Flawed, Frightening, and Our Best Hope. And I expect that these books, like Jed's past work, will reveal us to ourselves and provide us with a clearer vision of what we can achieve together, consistent with our core values in a distinctively liberal and democratic society. So without further ado, I ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Purdy to give the Wright Lecture this year.
Thank you so much, Larissa. Thank you so much, Dean Brunet, Professor Katz, Jutta, Larissa. It's really good to be here. I have old friends on the faculty. There are people on the faculty I've long admired. I feel are old friends in the sort of virtual way that you can become in this world, though I've just met some of you in person for the first time. It's always funny to visit a campus briefly. Each one has its own rhythm, its own desire lines, as the geographers say, that your feet fall into as you cross the grounds, the same characters, you pass under the same trees. And I won't have a sense of any of that in the short time that I'm here. But I am very glad to be here for the time that I have with you. Caesar Wright, as they called him, seems to have been an extraordinarily formidable figure. I had difficulty forming an impression of him confident and distinct enough in my reading over the last few days to attempt much to link the lecture with him and his legacy in particular. But I will say that I have felt connected to the University of Toronto Law School for a long time, not least by the person of your distinguished alumna, Gillian Lester, who was my beloved colleague and dean, and I do mean a beloved dean, at Columbia Law School, where I was on the faculty for several years until this year when my family and I returned to North Carolina and Duke. So my topic today is the question whether people who profoundly mistrust, fear, and disdain one another can rule themselves together. We live in a time of great ambition for democracy. Movements, governments, even scholars are pressing for more popular control over the basic terms of social life. In the US, and I'll say parenthetically that the spirit of this lecture and most of its examples turn out to be American in the parochial sense of the US. I actually tried to write it on a more comparative register and found myself returning to where my ground is most confident. So I offer it to you perhaps as an experiment for your own comparative work. In the US, this is true in the return of industrial policy, especially in green energy and microchips, in a revived antitrust policy concerned with the ways that concentrated economic power threatens democracy, and in a renewed attention to the ways that lawmaking is distributional at its core, from political campaigns to both socialism and nationalism, to distribution-sensitive analyses by the ultra-sober Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. In my corner of the Legal Academy, democratic ambition is expressing itself in what some of us call a law and political economy method, aimed at understanding how law constructs the economy, which in turn shapes and constrains politics. Our goal in this is to help set free democratic energies, to push forward the question what a democratic economy would be. This democratic energy is alive, too, in a wave of hostility to the anti-majoritarian features of the US Constitution, from the way it facilitates minority partisan control of the presidency, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, to the fact that an effectively unamendable Constitution gives the justices of the High Court a near monopoly on constitutional lawmaking. For the first time in generations, it's almost normal among American public law scholars to say that what makes fundamental law fundamental is the consent of the people who will live under it, and that a constitution not open to change is a kind of tyranny of the past over the present. For the first time in generations, again, there is mainstream talk of constitutional amendment, even constitutional convention. Some blinders have come off. Many Americans, I continue to situate the lecture where I stand, particularly the kinds who tend to populate the legal profession, were raised on a pair of ideas, one concerning the economy, the other concerning the Constitution. Economic life, we learned, was a domain with its own logic, simple in its basic principles, but gloriously complex as it played out, which benefited everyone in a sense, treated everyone equally in a sense, and made everyone free in a sense. If only we could resist the all too human impulse to interfere with it. Law had a role to play, of course, but it was the secondary role of the technician, helping to keep the engines of property and contract running smoothly, trimming transaction costs, and picking up negative externalities. The Constitution, we were taught, was also a domain of specialists, jurists who wove and rewove its principles. The US Constitution was practically synonymous with the activity of the Supreme Court, and as for that court, credentialed explainers intoned as late as the beginning of Justice Brett Kavanaugh's divisive confirmation hearing in 2018 that its authority rested on its being above and separate from mere politics, or at least on its being seen as above and separate from mere politics. These beliefs have grown hard to sustain. Economic life seems from many standpoints a domain of power, domination, and pervasive feedback of those forces into politics. The Constitution, too, has come to seem inseparable from politics. The Supreme Court, a site of partisan entrenchment and movement lawmaking. The Constitution's structural features, a keystone of minority rule. In less than 5 years, many Americans have learned to see the courts as creatures of politics, the least democratic branch, with no special warrant to rule over the rest. New calls for democratic control are efforts to reckon with these unsettling thoughts. But will they be an opening to an era of deepened democracy, or will they sink into the same democratic discontent that's inspired them? Symptoms of democratic crisis, but not answers to it. That's my question. Political cynics have often said that democracy, stripped of mystification, is nothing more than a larger part of the political community exercising power over a smaller part. And in some sense, this is right. We should not entirely run away from it, even though democracy also means rule among political equals, in which there is always a next election, so no decision and no governing coalition is final. For all of that essential, even constitutive qualification, ruling ourselves in a democratic sense does mean being ruled by majorities. The alternatives are consensus, which is rare, and when we have it means we don't need politics, or minority rule. That ruling ourselves means being ruled by majorities is frightening because any political power over us is frightening. But political power, clearly understood, is necessary. We need politics because we need answers to questions like what we will do about climate change and habitat preservation, how we will be taxed and policed, whether abortion is legal, and what happens at the border. You can want to reject wholesale the kinds of answers we've given to these questions, or even the framing of the questions. But no one can cogently deny that in some version they will get answers, even if the answers are radically different ones. An effort to dissolve the very terms of some of my questions, such as police and borders, would be a matter of giving different answers, different political answers, to inescapable questions about public safety and territoriality. Democracy comes closest of any system to the idea that the answers should come from the people who will live with them, from us. It makes us one another's rulers on questions where, because there has to be an answer, and the answer has to come from somewhere, there will be a ruler, and the fundamental question is who or where it will be. In this light, democracy means being ruled by one another. Can we stand to be ruled by one another? This is the question I mean to address through the concept of democratic trust. Let me give a definition, then, of trust in general. Trust is the constellation of attitudes that make dependence on others tolerable and make tolerable the vulnerability that dependence entails. This dependence is everywhere. We depend on others practically, on drivers not to swerve into us or run red lights, on medical workers to puncture and manipulate our bodies in ways that are intimate and dangerous and easily abused. Most of us who are parents depend on others whom we scarcely know to do some of the most important work of raising the children whom we sincerely say we love more than anything else in the world. We depend on the decisions of political representatives for protection of our most fundamental interests, extending to survival, the ground of all other interests. We depend on others epistemically, as virtually everything we believe we know outside our immediate experience rests on the warrant of others, frequently transmitted as a kind of cultural hearsay. In the usual empiricist sense, I don't know that Antarctica exists or that the US Civil War happened. And if some of you are prepared to assure me that you've seen Antarctica, I'm afraid I can also find some people who will assure me of very unsettling claims about the Civil War. Just to live our lives, just moving through the world, we assume so much consistency and basic goodwill. Trust fills the gap between what we can be sure of and what we assume and practice day to day. But the filling is always provisional, always under pressure. Both clinical paranoia and the paranoid style in politics, to adopt Richard Hofstadter's phrase, show how readily the gap can be filled instead of trust with doubt and conjecture, anxious imagination which can be compounded into theories of conspiracy. Trust, this gap filler, is what the cultural theorist Raymond Williams called a structure of feeling. Williams describes such a structure as comprising, quoting him now, characteristic elements of impulse, restraint, and tone, specifically affective elements of consciousness and relationships, not feeling against thought, but thought as felt and feeling as thought. End of the quote. Trust has, that is, an unmistakable emotional valence. It is something we feel as well as something we do. It's at once a disposition toward another person or an institution and a practical decision about how far to make ourselves vulnerable. Trust lets us pursue forms of cooperation and collective action that we could not do alone and which necessarily make us vulnerable to others. Cooperation increases our freedom and powers by putting them in concert, but only if we're willing to put ourselves in one another's hands again and again. When we successfully put ourselves in one another's hands, we trust. Or to put it differently, trust is what enables us to do this. It is both action and feeling, both verb and noun. Democratic trust. Democratic trust is a specific kind of trust in other citizens, a willingness to hand over some of the most important collective questions to shifting majorities. This willingness may be rooted partly in a judgment that others are morally and practically competent to make these judgments, partly in a kind of prior identification with them or with the country you compose together, so that it's almost axiomatic that what they say goes, at least until the next election. Democratic trust makes possible what I would contend is the most fundamental form of collective action. Decision over the terms of cooperation themselves, the rules and institutions that will structure shared life, again, at least until the next election. The question of trust, political trust, most often gets explicit public treatment through two kinds of research, which you may have encountered. One addresses interpersonal trust, also sometimes called social trust, basically whether you expect other people to do the right thing most of the time. In the US, according to the General Social Survey, the share of people saying they trusted others in this way mostly floated during the 1970s in the mid to high 40s, fell into the 30s in the 1990s, and right around 2006, fell into the very low 30s, where it's languished since then. And older people are holding up even these very modest figures. The younger respondents are, the less they say they trust others, and this seems to be a generational, not a life cycle effect. The second line of research concerns trust in public institutions. In the US, the Pew Center has been asking people since 1958 how far they trust the federal government, In 1964, 77% of respondents said they did, always or most of the time. In 2022, that figure is 22%. That is 55 points lower than in 1964. It's generally been under 50% since the late 80s and close to the current level since about 2010. There's a little more nuance in a long-running series of Gallup polls asking people to rate their levels of trust in specific institutions. Today, the institutions for which very little trust or none outweighs a great deal or quite a lot includes the Supreme Court, public schools, newspapers, Congress, and the presidency. For each of these, the balance was reversed, often very significantly, in 1973 when the question was first asked. Today, only the military enjoys strong majority trust, with the police, the medical system, and interestingly, organized labor coming in for ambivalent plurality support, though labor just by a whisker. And it seems in part because the people who really, really hate organized labor have been sort of politically deactivated and hate other things now. It's striking that the Gallup numbers on trust in institutions begin in 1973, which was not exactly a high watermark in civic comedy. President Richard Nixon would soon resign in scandal. Political violence and assassinations were much more frequent than today. An unpopular war was splitting the country, and unrest had recently burnt out neighborhoods across major American cities. Yet the public philosophy, for lack of a better term, seemed to be relatively optimistic about the capacity of the country's political institutions. So people are saying that they find it increasingly intolerable to depend on others, at least in the abstract, in general, and also intolerable to depend on public institutions. It isn't clear, by the way, how much these attitudes are reflected in day-to-day behavior. In other polling, with different methods, different sampling, massively higher shares of people say they trust others in their neighborhoods. But our idea of one another and of the institutions that stitch us together at a larger scale than neighborhood is wary and suspicious. Staying on for a minute with these two clusters of ideas, interpersonal or social trust and institutional trust. Interpersonal trust is often associated with the idea of social capital. It's thought very plausibly to enable people to cooperate without too many formal rules and structures, helping along business enterprise and civic initiative. People who don't trust one another, the thought goes, have greatly diminished power to do things together. Trust in institutions, in its turn, is connected with what's sometimes called governability, whether people are able to cooperate in the relatively complex, far-reaching, and lasting institutional ways that more local and spontaneous action may have trouble achieving, specifically through political governance. In both dimensions, the usual thought has it that societies low in trust will, other things being equal, have less cooperation and at the cost of relatively more explicit regulation and coercion. In particular, lack of trust seems to make distributional policy harder, except perhaps in the just print money mode, and indeed makes harder any policy requiring a dealing out of shared sacrifice, because suspicious minds will doubt the good faith of both the beneficiaries and the mediating institutions. So progressives and reformers generally seem to have the most to lose from lack of trust, which tends to inhibit basic change and keep us stuck where we are. Now, democratic trust, as I've defined it, is different from each of these, personal or social and institutional trust, although plainly related. It concerns specifically whether we accept fellow citizens as the ultimate judges on equal terms with us of how we will live together. As I say, this is clearly a neighbor of the more familiar concepts of interpersonal and institutional trust, respectively, but it's different and in some ways I would argue more fundamental to politics. Interpersonal trust is about whether others will do the right thing already established, while democratic trust concerns whether others are competent to decide what is the right thing to do together. Trust in institutions is vertical. Will I be governed fairly? While democratic trust is horizontal, the structure of feeling among co-citizens. Fundamental as it may seem, what I'm calling democratic trust doesn't put in much of an appearance in the voluminous scholarship on social and political trust. I suspect this is at least partly because that work took its shape in the academic mainstream between the early 1960s and the late 1990s, and has largely continued in the same vein. Those were decades in which, to generalize outrageously, respectable interest in democracy was focused on governance, constitutional principle, and representative institutions of the kind that in the US we call Madisonian. That is, the kind that baffle and break up political energy so that the very idea of popular decision seems a kind of chimera. So the recent impulse to greater democratic control both intensifies the reasons to care about the familiar categories of personal and institutional trust, and also raises sharply and newly the question of democratic trust. Some more on the latter. The standard treatments of social and political trust tend to assume that trust relationships are instrumental. Basically, we use them to protect or advance interests we already have. But democratic trust points to ways that, for better or worse, we are more profoundly in one another's hands than that. Trust relationships may also constitute our interests, give us our interests. Sometimes our interests, meaning not just preferences, but also values and commitments, all of them prima facie reasons for action, may come to be, in good part, those that emerge from a trusting relationship. This is not hard to see in a marriage, for instance, which only an extraordinary willfulness could insist on seeing as a concert of freestanding individual interests. What may be a little less familiar is seeing an analogous dynamic in politics, which one also cannot conduct alone, and whose purpose is, in good part, to resolve for everyone, and for now, questions on which citizens intensely disagree. We know, for instance, that partisan opinions shift on important matters such as foreign policy or racial justice as salient conflicts rise and fall. Republican views on Russia before and after 2016, for example, or rapidly shifting views among Democrats on racism and racial justice. And we may take these as signs of the insubstantiality of expressed political opinion. But another way of taking the same facts is that in key respects, we cannot say what our interests, values, and commitments are independent of political engagement, or at least that important areas are always open to political thematization, for better or worse. And these examples are merely about ideology or expressed views. Let's also note the more substantive and maybe more unsettling ways that democratic trust makes politics constitutive of our interests. Where we concede to fellow citizens the power to make basic decisions, we may soon find that we have adopted an industrial policy or a new interpretation of political equality, or that we are at war. Of course, there are liberal and indeed democratic reasons that accepting these conclusions should not be automatic or naive, but there's also a sense in which accepting them is definitional of being in a polity at all. The phrase, "not my president," while often sympathetic as an emotional matter, would amount, if it were taken seriously, not to dissent, but to personalized secession, which, if it were possible, would do a lot to annul the problem. The problem with the president is that he, following the gender of the relevant examples, is one's president. Here, as elsewhere, the assent we give to politics is testament to our thoroughgoing dependence. Who we are to one another is, this is really what I'm driving at here in this part of the lecture, who we are to one another is to a considerable degree an artifact of political decisions embodied in law, creating and distributing property rights in land and other forms of capital, shaping work relationships, honoring or punishing forms of gender identity. We don't, as individuals, make or choose these structures that make us. Even our sense of the alternatives, of the questions we might fruitfully pose about these structures, is a product of a politics that always takes place both within these structures and among and subject to multitudes of other persons. To have any role in the collective agency of politics, a person must first accept a quite profound denuding of any idea of self-reliance or, indeed, even individual agency, at least with respect to political matters. It's in this context that trusting makes tolerable, even makes welcome, forms of dependence that are, ironically, the precondition to forms of activity that people can only do together. Apart from, and earlier than the recent political science work that I've touched on, there are two major and contrasting traditions in political thought that deal centrally with trust. One, exemplified in Alexis de Tocqueville's writings on democracy, presents trust as a social precondition for political ordering. Near the heart of Tocqueville's account of American life was a shared, often implicit, social, legal, and moral agreement which stabilized politics, limiting the scope of conflict and providing a measure of assurance that the outcomes would not disturb settled expectations too far. He argued that this consensus enabled Americans to imagine that they practiced popular sovereignty when in fact they mostly recapitulated existing agreement. And I'll mention that the many, many theorists of trust who follow essentially in this view and take the position that, as the phrase goes today, culture is always upstream of politics, have not really reckoned with the ways that Tocqueville himself assumed that a form of supremacist racial solidarity was the precondition of strong political consensus of this kind among what he candidly called the Anglo-Americans. I'm a skeptic of this tradition in its strong form. In the other tradition, politics provides the conditions for trust and hence cooperation. This is most famously the tradition of Thomas Hobbes, who argued that political decisions of the sovereign, Hobbes would have said, establish property rights, set the bounds of bodily autonomy and security, and even fix the hierarchy of rank and esteem. All of these would draw people into conflict if politics did not settle them, according to this second tradition. And so, where for the first tradition there is no decent politics without trust, for the second there can be scant trust without politics. I think both traditions offer unsettling insights. One troubling scenario for the present would be that both traditions are true in a sense fundamental enough that, for example, we, one, need political action to strengthen interpersonal and institutional trust. It isn't organic, can't arise spontaneously, at least not in a form that we would like. And two, the erosion of those and of democratic trust may nonetheless stand decisively in the way of the same political action that we need. Each side of the division may be, for practical purposes, a precondition of improvement in the other. I leave that conjecture there for now. In a limited but real sense, the intensified democratic ambitions that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, and which prompt this entire reflection on democratic trust, represent a shift of political energies and imagination in a Hobbesian direction, a specifically democratic one. Those who push in that direction may tend to see trustmongers as anti-statists, as sentimental communitarians, as implicit conservatives. But trust is like history and like politics in the following respect. The fact that you aren't interested in it doesn't mean it isn't interested in you. It was as a partisan of these intensified democratic movements and demands that I began to be troubled by the question of trust. And it's in a sense arguing with myself and with my colleagues in those efforts that's what I'm doing here in trying to sort of think this question of trust with you. So I want to try staying with this sort of high political theory theme or register just for another moment, to try thinking beyond these contrasting traditions, the trust before politics tradition and the politics before trust tradition, but also with both of them. And in doing so, to take a cue from John Rawls's discussion of moral psychology in the late portions of A Theory of Justice. There, Rawls argues that one of the benefits of living in a just society, one ordered so that its basic institutions and operations treat all members fairly in terms of both procedures and outcomes, is that it reconciles prudence with trust. That is, in such a society, Rawls argues, Participation in the everyday life of institutions and the pursuit of reasonable self-interest don't set people at odds. Playing by the rules, to use that phrase, doesn't mean losing a game that is formally neutral but substantively unfair, for instance, with regard to the initial distribution of resources. The society doesn't force people to decide between cheating and losing. It doesn't foster the kind of suspicion that Donald Trump's 2016 campaign traded on, that the most corrupt person will have the clearest view of a rigged system. So understood, a just society creates circumstances in which others are more likely to deserve interpersonal trust. It does so because it doesn't present people with a choice between cheating one another and losing to one another. And it achieves this by providing an institutional structure that serves the reconciliation of parts of the self, prudent self-protection on the one hand, and on the other, the impulse to enter into relations of practical and moral reciprocity. Distrust, we may say, is among other things a failure to reconcile these, and it may be a perfectly sensible response to a tragic situation in which, for institutional reasons, they're not susceptible to reconciliation. I find Rawls's account helpful for integrating aspects of what I called the two traditions. Of course, it's true, as his social psychological portrait suggests, that trust is a social phenomenon, not political in the first instance. It arises from interpersonal relations and experiences which are always distinct from formal government. Trust is a disposition of persons. It's a way of feeling as well as acting toward others which can't be dictated or prescribed. To propose legislating trust seems like a category error, like adjudicating friendship or presenting forms of desire to Oira. But as Rawls's account also suggests, the relations and experiences from which trust and its opposites emerge all take place in an ecology of institutions. Trust isn't extra-institutional or pre-institutional, but a product of experience that is itself shaped by and within institutions. Particularly poignant to me in Rawls's picture is that it's within the self that the two traditions are integrated, or not, but the self within institutions. One is either, or perhaps one is more or less, divided within oneself, torn between trustworthiness and defection, between trust and suspicion, depending in good part on how far one's social order reconciles fair reciprocity with reasonable self-interest, or alternatively puts these motives incorrigibly at odds. Reading Rawls on this theme, I think, also highlights, it doesn't have to be Rawls. I omitted Rawls in this part of the text, but not in my voice. Trust is not ideologically neutral. It depends on political substance, a vision of the scope and purposes of politics. For example, in matters of distributive justice, one person's trust-inducing egalitarian social provision is another person's trust-eroding robbery by an overreaching state and its rent-seeking constituencies. What it means for institutions or fellow citizens to be trustworthy is a matter of the attitudes and public philosophy of the polity. And to the extent that a polity appears to its own members to be implacably divided over such matters, democratic trust may be untenable. To the extent that people regard their fellow citizens as basically incompetent and bewildered when not actually vicious, the result may be the same. Under such circumstances, discontent with present arrangements may nonetheless lead rhetorically to a sense that the people should take back control. That rhetoric, which flows naturally enough from the way that any nominally democratic polity is likely to teach citizens to talk about it, will often be accompanied by a genuine and even mobilizing sense that political drift or usurpation needs to be pushed back by democratic action. But all of this remains in basically conjectural politics, confronting a rigid and distasteful present with the banner of an underspecified but charismatic alternative, more democracy. For the alternative to carry over into sustained action, more is needed. A genuine and resilient willingness to decide with others and to let their decision be ours, at least until the next election. Absent this democratic trust, discontent with things as they are will often feel, when the chips are down, less urgent than fear of things as our fellow citizens might make them. In this situation, no amount of reluctance to accept things as they are can make up for the lack of an alternative course of action in which one can put one's trust. With that in mind, I'd like to move to a different register and try to supplement the political theory as well as the political science of the lecture by asking what the political economy of democratic trust might be. I'll pose this question. Does economic life present citizens to one another as potential co-rulers, or does it undercut that way of seeing one another? Is it, for most of its participants, a domain of agency among relative equals, or is it a domain of domination? And does economic life foster trust by presenting citizens to one another as collaborators in a potentially fair system of cooperation, or does it foster what we might call a kind of rational paranoia, in which people come to one another as manipulators, surveillance agents, hostile players in a game of doubtful integrity, which no one is free to stop playing? Although the classical modern theory of market society, exemplified in the Anglophone world in Adam Smith's writing, was not much concerned with the politics of self-rule, it did present a theory of markets as supporting social trust. Market relationships were essentially ones of reciprocity, Smith argued, in which people engaged in mutual persuasion about the content of one another's interests. The goal was an alignment of minds for exchange and cooperation, a series of negotiations and extensions of sympathy that 21st century thinkers might have called social capital. Everything in this social logic tended toward a harmonization of interests and a practice of cooperation, a daily seminar in trust, or so the story went. From the vantage of 2023, there are at least three ways in which the last few decades of economic trends seem to undermine what we might call the economic basis of trust. I give these as examples of a political economy of the present. They're fragments, no more than fragments, of a broader transformation of the material and ideological shape of economic life. That larger pattern, which is sometimes called neoliberalism, has among its drivers the collapse of public sector labor unions, which once created a modicum of collective countervailing power in the workplace, the dispersal of economic life through contract labor, complex supply chains, and remote work, so that the term workplace itself may seem anachronistic, and workers' collective action no longer has a natural locus corresponding either to the enterprise or to the national state, which were jointly essential to the 20th century model of labor's collective action. The withdrawal of the state from what one might think of as world-making infrastructure, including physical spaces such as libraries, parks, and public transit, and institutions such as public universities, and a general transformation of economic and social imagination in the direction of the free agent, entrepreneur, self-brander, and investor in one's own capital stock. These trends all increase vulnerability and precariousness in economic life and change the paradigm of agency from collective action to individual negotiation. They seem to me to make citizens more nearly strangers to one another and to reduce the chance to experience one another in everyday life as incipient co-rulers. But we know all of this. We know all of this. And the story of neoliberalism is one that around 2018, I began to skim in popular treatments of the present moment, because we all know the story. So I'm going to try to get more specific about a few examples, probably not the most important, certainly not the only ones, but perhaps exemplars, and try to think of them in terms of trust. The first is the ironic trajectory of capitalism's engagement with the human core of sociability via social media and the so-called sharing economy. For a time, some of you will remember this, it seemed halfway plausible that patterns like platforms like Facebook made possible an intensified and extended version of the core pleasures and comforts of social life. Mutual recognition, approval, affection, storytelling, sharing accomplishments and losses, just pointing to say, look, isn't that interesting? They seemed to have reconstituted some of the density of everyday intimacy of small-town life or high school or college in a manner consistent with the dispersed social geography of the 21st century, or at least of certain classes in the 21st century. It wasn't exactly civic, at least at its inception, but one had the sense of knowing people better and knowing more of them, as old classmates and passing acquaintances from a wedding or a work trip turned out to be deeply interesting and sympathetic people in whose lives one got invested. But it's now clear that the whole logic of this episode was to extract the same information that we eagerly shared, our attachments, affections, likes and aversions, quick and passionate reactions, the whole social repertoire, to organize marketing efforts more pervasive and tailored than any before in history. This isn't to say that this was the plan all along, but that social media took the only form compatible with profit-making at a level competitive with competing investment opportunities. Social life, and especially the parasocial form from which many of us have had trouble extracting ourselves, is now saturated with forms of manipulation that turn our sociability against us, instrumentalizing the most non-instrumental ties and activities. Caveat emptor. Second is the rise of technology-enabled surveillance through the workplace. The idea that the always-be-selling ethic of market society produced mutual sympathy and gentle mores was perhaps never all that satisfactory, especially under large-scale enterprise. But when those characteristic market interactions are under constant observation for signs of discontent, unfriendliness, or malingering, as they are from many, many people in today's workplaces, in cameras and email monitoring and phone monitoring, then Adam Smith's optimistic portrait morphs into a Foucauldian panorama in the style of Bosch, a form of market activity in which the worker is always wondering who's going to betray them, the customer, the supervisor, or the surveillance device, is a bit of social architecture that might as well be designed to undercut everyday social trust and perhaps leave less substrate for democratic trust. Third is the way that social media and partisan media more generally shape political sentiments in the service of a profit model. Adam Smith observes in his theory of moral sentiments that people care less about whether others share their affections than whether they share in their resentments. If that's not necessarily true in general, it is definitely true that both online and broadcast media have taken partisan forms that are working overtime to make it true. Specifically, these media have refined, it has to be said, not invented, a business model that commodifies resentment and anxiety, holding attention, which is the thing they want, with constant reminders of the alarming and execrable things that partisan others are saying and maybe planning. As a pathway to holding attention and selling ads, this turns out to be quite a powerful strategy. It succeeds by emphasizing the reasons that viewers and users might regard partisan others as intolerable co-rulers. These media run on a profit model that both provides a feeling of political engagement and accustoms participants to regarding fellow citizens as people with whom it is intolerable to share power. In this culture, to be political just is to grow ever more acculturated to the assumption that democratic co-rule is unacceptable, because we, whoever we are, live among people whose judgment we are constantly reminded we cannot possibly stand to entrust with our future. Think of the way that it turns out that Fox News executives, far from understanding themselves as puppet masters in the propagation of the big lie about the 2020 election, regarded themselves as on strings themselves, terrified to break from Trump's dangerous and crazy story because they would lose audience. It's like Marx's famous remark that you think under capitalism the banker has the power, but the banker is just as constrained as everyone else. He's just playing a different part according to the rules. The profit model of the attention economy seems to have some of the same logic. By the same token, now, these media intensify in-group solidarity and indeed a certain kind of trust. In participating in them, one conveys a good deal of epistemic and moral authority, bit by bit, to the most vocal members of one's own partisan cultural clan. Because of the profound dependence in knowledge and judgment that trust is testament to, this authority has to reside somewhere as a matter of day-to-day practice. We have to be relying on someone to tell us what's happening in the world and what it means, because we certainly don't know ourselves. This is a particular way of granting it. On both Fox News and progressive Twitter, denunciation is the basic act of political expression, which both ratifies the rightness of one's own group and confirms the intolerability of the other. This kind of trust, accorded to one's own plan in this practice, is nominally concerned with political matters. Indeed, the business model benefits from discovering the partisan dimensions of questions previously thought to be safely private or neutral. And this tactic has produced a right wing that's as eager to thematize as political what was once thought merely given as a certain kind of intellectually ambitious left has long seemed to be. Yet there's an ironic way in which this sort of partisan trust is anti-political for all of its political insistences. It presents as morally unacceptable the only path forward in democratic politics, which is to find ways of sharing rule even amid intense and persistent disagreement. It's telling that one of the most charismatic ambitions of technologists and entrepreneurs in the last decade has been the effort to produce a technical substitute for both trust and the state in the form of blockchain code with cryptocurrency, only its most recently famous application. Our age has, depending how one looks at it, either no utopias or many weak and scattered utopias. One of the latter is the idea that our obligation to one another could be restricted to those arising from voluntary transactions in a matrix of exchange that required neither politics nor sociability, just code. While libertarianism is not a new dream, this version of it chimes eerily with a time lacking resources for both the decentralized action of social capital and the joint action of democratic trust. As I mentioned earlier, worrying about trust can seem to be the preserve of a certain kind of cultural conservative or apolitical moderate. It can seem scolding, as if the lack of trust were some sort of personal or generational failure of civic morality. And it can seem jejune, as if all we needed were better intentions, a softer, light view of one another. In taking on trust from the perspective of democratic ambitions in political economy, I'm trying to make a start toward engaging it in ways that resonate outside those habits of thought, and also toward persuading those who think of their positions as more critical, more political, that they, or we, can't look away from the question of trust. It should be clear, from all I've said, that differently situated people will often have more or less reason to trust, and that mistrust can be perfectly sensible. It's well established that Black Americans report lower levels of personal and institutional trust than white Americans, and that people with more money and educational credentialing report higher levels of trust than others. All of these attitudes seem very likely to be well supported and founded in people's own experience. I don't for a moment intend the moralizing or reproachful account of trust. The paradox is that those who are disadvantaged, marginalized, or ripped off by systems as they stand are precisely the people who have the most at stake in successful political engagement with those systems. To think of something like rebuilding trust as a desirable goal, then, may be part of a democratic or even a radical program of change. At the same time, the question of trust in what and in whom becomes particularly important. We've touched, for example, on the way that certain populisms in our time combine intense trust of certain leaders. I didn't actually talk about that. I talked about reliance on your sort of most vocal political co-partisans. But the same dynamic applies to an intense trust of certain leaders. Think of Trump, think of Bolsonaro, along with an intense distrust of established institutions. Or, closer to what I said before, these populisms combine an intense trust of a certain idea of the people with intense distrust, or worse, of many of the people one actually lives among, who get classified as the wrong kinds of people, not the real people. As Trump once put it with rare succinctness, The important thing is the unification of the people, and the other people don't matter. An old left-wing idea of solidarity, for a counterexample, sought to build a version of trust to make working-class action possible. The point of such slogans as "an injury to one is an injury to all" was that if you believed that other people also believed this and had your back accordingly, you would act and take a risk on their behalf. This has always been elusive, and it's arguably been in decline for a long time. Already in 1964, Raymond Williams, again this time as a novelist, had Harold Owen, his fictional trade union leader, lament in the face of a shaky strike, quoting, "There's no trust, that's the trouble. We know each other too deep." Is distrust the only way of knowing each other deeply? Talk about rebuilding trust often runs to the idea of getting people together outside of politics, in national service, for example, or in fond ideas of a peacetime draft. I start out sympathetic to all of this for what it's worth. I think it's also worthwhile asking whether politics can provide its own resources of trust sometimes, whether it can be a virtuous circle in contrast to the trust-depleting cycles that I've been describing. One thing social psychologists tell us is that people overcome division and build trust when they do something together, something important, concrete, and also possible, such as repairing a broken-down bus they're all riding or building shelter when they're caught outside together. Certainly, politics can be like this, if enough is at stake in it and if it can be made to work. That's easier said than done, but it doesn't seem to be an impossible standard. Here is at least a question to pose. My fellow progressive legal scholars try to think about their reform proposals dynamically by aiming at what they call non-reformist reforms. That is, reforms that don't just tweak some policy outcome, but shift the balance of power so that other kinds of changes become more likely down the road. It's worth asking a similar question about trust. Does a mobilizing strategy, a goal, or a coalition cast its divisions, because politics always casts and proposes divisions, it always does, in ways that point to a larger, more inclusive majority down the road? Does it seek changes, such as in economic life, that present us to one another as more nearly equal, as potential co-authors of a world? Or does it do the opposite? It's possible that at stake in the answer is nothing less than democracy itself. That's what I have to say. Thank you so much for listening, and let's talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Sweeping, gripping, and challenging in the best sense, because I think you really challenged us to think. And so we will throw the floor open for questions, thoughts, provocations, please.
Yes, and if you don't mind, some of you I haven't met or haven't met recently, you'll just remind me.
Professor Purdy, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My name is Larry Herman.
Hi, Larry.
Class of 69, with my erstwhile classmate, Professor Sharp. Class of 60, he was class of 70, but he started in 1966 with me, and Cecil Wright was dean when I entered the law school. So you've described very well the concept of trust. You've described very well the concept of trust, and you've deconstructed the notion of trust. You've suggested that there are different schools of thought, and I thought that was very well done. I'm disturbed by your presentation, because in describing the concept of trust, you've really told us how trust has broken down in civil societies and Western democracies. And that's kind of a pessimistic presentation. We've seen trust broken down significantly south of the border in your country, and in our country, we've had very serious indications, examples of the breaking down of trust, institutional trust, interpersonal trust that you described. But I'm asking you to to look forward and give us an optimistic forecast. How do we rebuild either institutions that have broken down or trust relationships which are broken down? What is the positive prescription for our Western societies, given what you've described?
Thank you. So, oh yes, it says, please do not sit on the table. I don't normally encounter quite such a specific reproach in the infrastructure. No, thanks. I'm good. Yeah, perfect. So, in some ways, I have to say, the reason that I'm not going to run away from the question, but I think the answer has to be, it has to turn on facts that we don't know yet. You know, it's a matter of trying things and seeing whether they work. So in some ways, we get not definite answers, but we get cues from looking around us and from looking back. So when I look back, I'm struck by something about the discourse of environmental crisis in the 1960s and 1970s compared to now. I'd be interested in whether this chimes with your sense of it. But I've gone back and read a lot of both the New York Times, Time Magazine kind of discovery that the world was in crisis in the 1960s, and also the movement literature. And what was sort of remarkable was the conjunction of the feeling that the world was dying and we were in terrible danger with the confidence that we could do something about it, and do something about it tomorrow. And in fact, in a rather real sense, for some decades, things did get done about it. The US had an extraordinary period of environmental legislation between 1969 and 1973. It passed sweeping laws that retooled important parts of the economy and land use, and did so by big majorities. And when you go back and look at the congressional debates, you see people saying things like, well, let's try this with the Clean Water Act. And you know what, if this doesn't work, we'll come back in 2 years and we'll fix it. I mean, imagine saying that now. You spend 10 years getting one piece of legislation through the US Congress, and then basically you know that everything is going to be in the administrative agencies if the courts don't strike it down. But there was a real sense of democratic capacity that coexisted then with the sense of crisis. So, yeah, absolutely. I think the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, and the environmental lawmaking period of the late 60s, early 70s, I think are, in the US, they're the most salient evidence that it's possible and almost normal to remake the world through political action that's embodied in law. So that confidence didn't come from nowhere. You know, it was in some ways that confidence in the late 60s, early 70s was, I tend to think, the last great expression of the New Deal and post-New Deal sort of confidence among lawmakers and advocates that the state can remake the economy when it has to. It shouldn't be done casually, but when you have a crisis, a deep human or ecological crisis, you do things differently. And we know that kind of trust can be destroyed. I mean, it's been, I didn't really talk about this, but it's been a very deliberate, often racialized partisan strategy, right-wing partisan strategy in the US to cultivate mistrust of the federal government in particular, to defeat the potential for redistributive or even just basically egalitarian, like simply like fair treatment egalitarian policies. But it can also be built up by successes, and successes that are seen to be successes. So there's a relationship actually between what I call non-reformist reforms, changes that make more change more likely, maybe, and trust building. Like not only trust in the state, trust in ourselves, trust that we can do this. So I both take some hope from and feel a lot of trepidation about, feel a lot is at stake in what comes in the next 5 years and what's seen to come. of the Biden administration's commitment to major public investment in green technology. I think if it succeeds and is seen to succeed in some serious way, then it's the beginning of thinking at one level, by no means the only level, but at one very important level, of political capacity to confront the environmental crisis is a real thing that we have. And if not. I think it's examples like that. Another thing that I will just say I want people to tell me about, because I don't know, is what's happening after 2020 and the movement for Black Lives Matter protests in the US. What's happening to policing at all in the places where policing policy really happens in the US? And we know nothing's happened at the national level, but are things really, really happening in lots of jurisdictions? Is it changing? I don't know, but I want to know. I think it's like the incredibly important question is, was that a moment, just an expressive moment, or was it an actualization of reform capacity? I guess my point is, whenever people understand that they actually have the power to remake things, and they then find the world they've remade is actually better for enough of them to live in together, that's sort of where it comes from. And that's part of what I meant to say in saying that trust is a sentiment, but its sources are not necessarily sentimental. And the best way to think about it is not necessarily sentimental. Thank you for the question and for prompting the tolerating the long response.
We were hoping for more long answers. David, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm David.
Yes, of course.
We just met.
Yes, in one sense, we just met.
Yeah. I'm neither an historian nor a sociologist, so these are going to be some very amateurish reflections.
I'll meet them in kind, I promise.
But if one looks back at the last century, right, the first 50 years were not really years, at least in the small part of the world that we're talking about now, like North America, Europe, and so on. The first 50 years of the last century were not years where there was much trust around. And one can see two major ruptures, the First World War and the Second World War. And it's only, I think, after the Second World War that we see a kind of huge change in trust relationships. And perhaps that has to do with the fact that, as you were referring to the draft military service, people actually had stood shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. So there was this experience of trust building. There was also a sense that people could reshape the world. And that coincided with an ability to produce an economic boom that lasted for quite a long time. And that economic boom took place in countries which were fairly homogeneous. Now that all seems to have broken down, right? So the good economic
Yes.
times have gone. People no longer feel secure in their jobs, whether they or feel secure about having a job at all. Whether or not in their old jobs they felt like they were being treated as equals, they at least had a decent paying job and could think that their children would have such a job. And at the same time, the societies have become less homogeneous, so disturbed by the presence of others and the growing presence of those others in their society. So they apparently many white people in your part of the world feel really threatened by demographic changes. And so the background conditions are the kind of more, was it de Tocqueville that you refer to? That kind of basis, the social basis of trust seems to have vanished. And I thought towards the end you were moving more towards, was it the Hobbesian view, that it's through politics that we can build trust? But I'm not quite sure how that works once this rather fragile basis that existed for some time after the Second World War has eroded.
David, thank you. I think I share your picture of our dilemma. In a sense, I did want to say that trust is a genuinely social and cultural phenomenon, but one that emerges, as it were, not before or outside of institutions and laws and politics, but in the context that they make, maybe dialectically between the two characterizations, to use a technical term in an untechnical way. So let's say a couple of things about the specific kind of historical forces that you know. One thing, this is almost like starting with the one that goes least to your point, but then I want to come more to your point. But I find this one very interesting. I didn't say it in the lecture. The period in which we know something about social and political trust in this public opinion form, like so much else in the common culture of the contemporary West, and particularly our academy, was shaped in that rare period of relatively equal distribution, of relatively robust economic growth, at least among economic insiders, who were a lot of people. And so we know of about 20 years of good or high levels of trust in the aftermath of the Second World War, roughly. The numbers start about 15 years, 12, 15 years into that period. And then we know of about 30 years of declining trust, basically following the reversal of the trends toward wealth and income inequality around 1973. So this may be one of those ways in which what common sense of a certain kind in the North Atlantic regarded as normal was the short-lived summer, as it were, of the great contraction in wealth and income. And it may be that the baseline is more divided and more sensibly divided because people are, in a sense, objectively more at odds. So there's a kind of pessimistic view from the kind of long account of political economy. I think it's, yes, but
along the lines of what you're talking about, what I've been thinking about this whole time is what galvanizes a nation or a people is usually a common enemy. If you look at the Second World War, everybody was on board because the common enemy was the Third Reich, for example. The missile crisis in the 60s with Kennedy, that galvanized the nation, because our safety was at risk, our well-being was at risk. And that seems to be those hallmarks in history usually have some kind of a threat to our social stability, and that's what galvanizes. And then it seems like you work your way through, for example, the Second World War, and we were in a building period in the 50s and the 60s. Everybody was working. They were rebuilding the economy, essentially, after the Second World War. And it goes on, and then it sort of filters off because the building has completed, so to speak. Now you have to look for another common enemy to get everybody galvanized again to plow forward. So it's an interesting kind of balance between the politics and the economy, how that works. Because usually what galvanizes everybody and builds that common trust, if you will, is when their social well-being is at threat.
So this is a very helpful prompt and sort of concentration of a couple of other things I wanted to say to David. So thank you for the interjection. One is it does indeed seem that it was very significant when you think about the successful egalitarian politics such as they were after the Second World War, that people had literally just seen their lives saved by their co-nationals, their co-citizens. I mean, that's very profound. But at the same time, it's not that we are entirely without such considerations. Climate and other forms of ecological threat are indeed threats to our well-being and even survival. Again, when I looked back at the history of environmental mobilization, the thing that struck me about it was that great moments of political creativity in that domain were always at the meeting place of a sense of terrible threat and a sense of something to move forward, something to achieve, something to fear and something to love and move closer to. We're both part of it. I also here find it helpful, and this is in a way the Hobbesian point, how deeply politics shapes the we that experiences and acts on political solidarity. I mean, as you know, here's my amateurish historical sociology that I promised to offer in kind, but those relatively homogeneous nations that are now sort of palpitating with xenophobia and discontent took a long time to build as nations. That homogeneity was achieved and not given for better and worse. Cultural and political nation building was a multi-century project. So it's both true, point to Tocqueville, if I can use that shorthand, that we trust people who are like us, and point, if I can use the shorthand, to Hobbes, we don't know who's like us in a way before we do politics together. And I think part of the power of the solidaristic tradition in social mobilization that I adverted to was its effort to create, in a sense, the best, the best of wartime sensibility in a spirit of common cause toward a more egalitarian society without actually needing a unified national we that has an enemy outside it. I think the good war may excessively amplify our sense of that paradigm as opposed to the paradigm of fighting ecological threat or the paradigm of trying to recover the very capacity to rule ourselves from a drift toward profound inequality and oligarchy, which could also be horizons worth trying to press back against and move beyond.
I'll bring Larissa in. She has a question, and then Chris, and then in the back. 3 on tap for you.
Great. I will be quicker. Should we group or do we have enough time?
We probably have enough
Okay.
time for the next 3. And
Okay.
then we'll see
Perfect.
What we do.
Perfect.
Great. So Jed, I wanted to ask you a little more about a comment you made in the talk that we lack utopias today, or if we have them, they're scattered and weak ones. Because, in fact, when I'm reflecting on all the things you've been talking about today and writing about recently, I think there is actually a utopia vision that unites us, which is a desire for a community of trust, or communities of trust, if you like. And so to create communities of trust in a world where we don't know who is like us, I think we look to impersonal trust-building machines like property, but also, I think, certain political tools that we have. So in property, we see people reaching for, common development schemes, restrictive covenants, whatever it is. So as in the absence of any clear sense of who is like us, we set up a system where people can slot in who end up being like us, and everyone else is outside because we're looking for something, a community of trust. And so that's a world in which, there's a reciprocity of interests presupposed by these common development schemes where we're each equally benefited and burdened, and your neighbor ends up being someone who fits the bill, right? And I guess the political tools that might do something like that, in a kind of more territorial way, are a little out of reach still, but they're what people are crying out for. And so, recently Oregon, as you might have heard, is full of these calls to kind of split the state so that those kind of coastal people, don't taint the political dialogue that allows us to form a community of trust. And so I wonder whether, the old, problem that trust is a sentimental thing, that it is the stuff of people's dreams and, utopian visions and so on, still plagues us today. And that it's not that we're in a world of distrust, but that we're in a world that is just like so keen to reestablish trust that is reaching for these, not markets so much anymore, but, property and politics in a different way?
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. It really pushes me to differentiate more sharply between the argument that trust of a certain kind is something that we need in principle to do strong democratic politics. And I think that's right. I actually think that argument is right. I think that if people will not feel that they cannot hold still for and abide by for a time the decisions of a majority that they dislike or distrust, then we can't make collective decisions in a democratic fashion. But I think that has to be very sharply distinguished from a nostalgia for actual or imagined pasts that seemed like if they could be reconstituted, they would make trust easy. And I agree with you, it's not the market anymore because people either they don't believe in the thin form of reciprocity. Well, I talked about a bunch of ways that have become sort of nightmarish, and I think people have in various ways experienced all of those, so I won't kind of rehearse it. So I think it's actually true both that we need trust properly understood and that we are haunted by plagued by a nostalgic appetite for what some people imagine are the conditions of easy trust. And I would say diagnostically, I think in our world, if I may, we're properly attuned to the second kind of problem enough that we may sort of think that that's what talking about trust is, that it's just nostalgic per se. And I don't think it's nostalgic per se. I just think that it's hard. I do think, you didn't ask about secession, but secession talk in the US, which sort of shifts its ideological balance depending who's in power and which region you're in, it is the most maddening thing in the way that it fantasizes a certain homogeneity, kind of region to region or sub-region to sub-region, when in fact there are people of all sorts caught everywhere, such that you'll always, I live in North Carolina, so I know this very vividly, you're always going to have the population that's under the boot heel of whatever new homogeneity you've achieved with your secession. So when we try, I know you're not suggesting this, but I just sort of have to get it off my chest. When we try to get the difficulty out of politics by breaking it down into smaller and smaller units, we just replicate the same problem in these sort of fantasy-driven fragmentations, these like little fractals of the big problem. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm with you on this.
Is this on? I'm Chris Esser. We've been on this.
Yeah, exactly. I like your boots.
Oh, thanks. They're the official boots of Toronto. We can talk about them. We can talk about them later. Everybody in Toronto owns them. They give you a pair when you move here. I have a property law question too, unsurprisingly. And it's about there's two different expressions that you use at different points, one of them at length and then one of them a bit shorter. And I wondered if you could reflect on the connection between them. So the first one, when you're talking about especially the environmental legislation, you use an expression like sort of remaking the world. And then there was one point when you were giving a list of examples of how things are, ways in which they're bad. You said governments have given up on their capacity to make the world. And there I took you to be talking about the physical world, right? So you said building schools, universities, things like that. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about the way in which sort of public space, right, is a kind of a located version of the dynamic, right? So the phenomenon, one way to think about the phenomenon of kind of privatization of public space over the last 40 years is that it takes away the possibility of spaces in which we're kind of forced, right, to confront people in a democratic sort of way and generate kind of democratic forms of trust, and allows us to kind of retreat into little fiefdoms where, you know, I know who's going to be there, I know that I trust them, and you sort of see that, and then it just has this cycle, right, where it's sort of self-replicating and self-reinforcing. So I wonder if you have kind of thoughts about the possibility that, you know, a revivified public spaces might be in various ways kind of generating of trust of the sort that you're interested in.
I'm going to say I completely agree with what you say. You've understood me exactly. I think the example of the great public university in the second part of the Second World War is particularly powerful, in part because it both creates a space where a new kind of extensive, more widespread and inclusive commonality and sociability is possible, and it connects it with a certain idea of what social mobility or progress is, which is not just individuals winning a meritocratic contest, but whole classes of people moving together to a different kind of level or register of possibility. So I think it's not just, not that you said it was, that people are brought into the same space, but that they're brought into a space that enables them to do something together that they couldn't do without that space, which is a literally public space. I find it, again, thinking about environment and land use, striking both that many of the early defenses of the parks are, and the very articulate defenses of the parks are, that they are Republican, small r Republican, equivalents to the royal and aristocratic privileged lands. I'm forgetting exactly what term people like Olmsted use here, but they're Republican versions of those. That is a part of what makes it so important to think now about the ways that public lands don't feel public, where they persist, don't feel public to everyone, and like for whom they are common lands, and for whom they're stolen lands, and for whom they're lands where they don't feel welcomed. But to the real, that is all to agree and amplify, and then to say what next? What sort of does that next? I don't know, and I think it's characteristic of this time. I don't mean to be a bummer, but it's sort of characteristic of this time that we're in the aftermath of this period where people for a while would have said, oh, the internet. So that's not it, at least not as presently constituted by the profit model we're talking about. Not that it's going away, but I think we don't actually know. What comes after you don't think the internet is the public square? And can it be as ambitious as the public universities were? Because they really were world-making. And then eventually they became another, they got involved in the same form of class stratification and opportunity hoarding by the upper middle class, and sort of scraps for everyone else, and then resentment about all of that as everything else. But they really were world building, and what could do that is I think sort of our question. And to come back to the very first thing I said, I mean, the answer is a fact that we don't know yet. We have to try things. I'm very genuinely interested in people's instincts about what this might be, because I'm certainly not sure.
All right, so there were two more questions, one in the very back and then Mohammed, and we can probably take one more, but we're going to take them all and go Jean-François. So if you could keep your questions relatively tight, and then Jed will do his best to
I'll start writing.
address them all. So we'll start in the back. If you could say who you are.
Hi, I'm Jackie Brown. I'm a second-year law student at U of T. Thank you so much for this talk. It was very interesting. I'm just wondering, we have various political tools for expressions of the democratic will. So, of course, voting, also referendums, but especially in the US, where issues have seemingly become so completely polarized, the majority view seems like it may only be the majority by a very slim margin. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around possible futures for democratic engagement that recognize this problem where a significant minority of people feel that they are maybe not represented by the popular will.
Great question. I'm not here to, intimidate you into making it shorter. I'm just the runner here. Wow.
Thank you, Professor Purdy, for your very interesting lecture. I'm a professor of law here at the faculty.
Yes.
I'll be joining with dinner, so I'll try to be very brief.
I was admiring the poster on your door earlier.
Oh, thank you. So I have a lot of thoughts on your paper. I'm trying to be very succinct. I think following up on David's comments, if we want politics to produce trust for us, Rawls tells us that it's plausible to think that this is something we can reasonably hope for because productive cooperation can overcome suspicion among otherwise divided citizens. So if you take this insight and you apply it to the American polity, you can say, oh, okay, it's clear why America is failing in this because of its radically divided conception of sovereignty combined with radical decentralization. It makes the cost of cooperation virtually impossible to overcome. But then on the other hand, you look at the United Kingdom, where you have sort of parliamentary sovereignty, perfectly unified sovereignty, and if anything, its politics is even more pathological than the United States. And the desire for a kind of organic community of trust preceding politics might be even more powerful than the United States, right? So what's the link between, it's hard to understand whether any kind of institutional model, we have an institutional model for politics in contemporary market capitalism that can generate civic trust in the way that Rawls hoped.
All right, we'll tee up one last one, and that gives you lots to work with.
Thank you, Professor Purdy. Jean-Christophe, we met earlier.
Yeah.
I think it's, again, a variation perhaps on what Larissa asked earlier and Mohammed's question. I'll try to be brief as well because your talk generated so many thoughts. I have a question about someone that you didn't mention, but that kind of intervened in the liberal democratic conversation between Hobbes and Tocqueville, and that is Rousseau. Because Rousseau seems to be saying, if we want to have Republican freedom, we have to have specific kinds of mores, and this looks like a little bit what you're talking about when you're talking about trust. Now, Tocqueville, what he does, he tells us something that it's possible to have Republican freedom in a big country like the US, but you still have to base this on some kind of local mores. So that political power is based on the trust that is generated at the local level. Now, when you're talking about high levels of trust, you're also talking about a period of centralization, increased centralization. So I'm wondering if what we see is not actually just in the end, a reckoning that we were perhaps optimistic about the rejection of the small republic thesis. That is, it's possible to have Republican freedom in a big polity. And we realize, because if you were to ask the same questions about trust in government for a Texan in Texas and New Yorkers in New York, they would probably trust more their state governors than the federal government. So I'm just wondering if we were perhaps over-optimistic in our rejection of the small republics thesis.
Yeah. This is an incredibly powerful and challenging trio of concluding questions. And I genuinely want first to say that they're all questions that I think one just has to live with and think with. And I don't pretend that what I say is going to somehow put them to rest. But what I have to say, I'll take in order. Jackie, right? So I think in some ways, and here I do feel a little, I guess, reproachful toward my fellow USians, that we need to get better. Other things equal, I'm terrified of what it will look like if Trump wins again, were to win again, then in the next cycle. I think it's terrifying. But I think there's nonetheless a sense in which we need to get better at the thought that we're not going to be, any of us are not going to be in the majority for chunks of time. And we have to be able to live with that, because an allergy to that is a basic feature of democratic system is going to sort of guarantee that it can't work or can't work very well or very long. And I think that is going to maintain a kind of downward spiral in trust in institutions and the kind of capacity, which I think is really the thing that's fundamentally at stake, the capacity of the people who have to live with the world to make decisions about what its shape is going to be and to make decisions about what their relations to one another are going to be, because those will always take the shape they do because of some decisions that are made somewhere. And I don't mean it in a conspiratorial or paranoid sense, but it's sort of like it's politics or the market, and the market is always politically shaped, but the market is always also itself, and it's politics of a genuinely democratic sort, or it's politics of a more exclusionary and frightened and nasty sort. And I think it's only with a kind of slightly more courageous sort of conception of democracy and the risks it entails that we have a chance of getting closer to, let alone sustaining, the version of rule among majorities of equals as like in deciding what we're going to do. So I want people to buck up a little rather than find ways to put more barriers between us and the government. Putting barriers between us and the government has been so much of what American constitutionalism has been about for so long, from the fragmentation of sovereignty at the beginning to the central place of the courts in the sort of liberal imagination of the second half of the 20th century. And I'm just not sure that it's been, I don't think it's worked out. But could anything work out? And Mohammed, the contrast between the UK and the US, going directly to the heart of the kind of structural constitutional diagnosis of American maladies that I'm affiliated with, is it's the question in a way. I mean, are these crises somehow so shape-shifting, so determined by some structural, technological, cultural spirit of the age that it doesn't matter which institutions we build and call sovereign, that somehow like the virus is going to get in? The virus of xenophobia, the virus of mutual mistrust and disdain, the virus of nostalgia, however we want exactly to characterize what links these very different constitutional orders that seem to be undergoing parallel kinds of crisis. Jutta and I were talking just before the lecture about this moment of kind of disjunction in liberal legal conversation, where in the US, the people I'm around are saying we have to take on the courts, we have to challenge the courts, we have to have a facial confrontation with them. And in Israel, liberals are saying the only thing that can save us from ethnic majoritarianism is the court. Somehow, that is there a sense in which the kind of the institutional forms are incidental or epiphenomenal to the problem? I mean, I think it has to be the basis of a much longer conversation about what we think they're epiphenomenal of, and why we think that is ubiquitous and ascendant, if we do think it's ascendant. You said global capitalism. Maybe it's a kind of Polanyian account. So we'd have to kind of talk more about sort of what's the social theory in which this set of pathological dynamics is becoming so shape-shifting that it might seem to be inevitable. And I realize that you did us the tremendous service of being very succinct. So it'll have to be, I think, just a further conversation. I see you looking at me, and I know silently thinking, well, I have answers to all of this, but you just keep talking, or at least like responses. But I mean, I mostly just like want to honor the weight of the question. It is sort of the problem. Is there a kind of answer in the form of political voluntarism and institutional work that can get us a better grip on these questions? Or is the fact that, say, in my own country, the worst form of politics has been relentlessly minoritarian and has depended on our sovereign fragmentation and our minority entrenching constitutional features. Is that just, would it have been just different, if we had a parliamentary system? Excuse me, I'm putting it poorly. Would the same pathologies just have taken a different form? We'd have to be able to conjecture an answer to that question. And if the answer is yes, then in some sense this project really is, a lot of our work is spitting in the wind, and actually we would do well to confront that and ask what we ought to be doing instead. Jean-Christophe, in a sense, the spirit of my response is the same. I'm really haunted by this question. And I will say that when I talk to some other progressive law professors whose names you'll know, just happens that the conversations I feel are probably in confidence because of their public profiles, other people have said very similar things to me. Like, basically, what if we were wrong to think that you could do this on a scale larger than Switzerland? And not 21st century Switzerland either, but 18th century Switzerland. Well, I guess it depends partly what you mean by this. And I do think, to our earlier discussions about the New Deal, the first environmental movement, which was and wasn't, and the civil rights movement, there certainly are ways that mobilized minorities have transformed and made genuinely more humane and more politically egalitarian large-scale forms of life. So in that sense, it's not that we can't do anything, or that we can't do anything to make things in a real sense more democratic, or if one prefers more small r Republican in these kinds, at this kind of scale. But there may be a way that at this kind of scale, if it's always politics and the market, and if politics tends to get attenuated and the market tends to get accelerated at the scales we're talking about, there may be a long-term dynamic toward the erosion of productive forms of politics and its replacement by more fantastical and pathological forms of politics. That would be the pessimistic view. In a sense, I think one just has to have that clearly, or as clearly as possible, in view while trying to think more constructively. Because at least, as I've said a couple of times, the answer depends on facts that don't exist yet. And we do know that at least we will be, in some partial and limited sense, the authors of some of those facts. And that, I think, is at least something that we can hang a sort of practical hope, if not actually optimism, on.
Big thank you, Jed.
Is that
this
all
was
that's left to do?
fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you also.
I think at some point you said these are things we have to live with and think with, is how you put it, and I think that's right. And I have a feeling also you said something about longer conversations. I have a sense there will be lots of longer conversations that folks will take away from this. So thank you so much. This was very generous. This is a very small something to take with you, live with. Probably not think with, but it's been great. Thank you so much for this fantastic lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yes. Thank you.